Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and I'm just taking a few moments to let you know that this clip that you will see after this introduction is from one of my online classes, and I've decided to edit them so that more people can benefit from these lectures that I deliver pretty much every week. So enjoy and let me know what you think about it. Thank you so much. All right. So now that you have read your Chinua Achebe essay, right? So one thing should become very clear to you, that the reason I choose to teach this novel isn't because it's a classic or it's a great novel. I mean, the purpose is to kind of discuss in a sophisticated manner the nature of literary racism, right? How does it offer itself as literature, right? And how can it even perpetuate itself almost 100 years after the novel was published because of the work of scholars, right? Or work of literary scholars who somehow want to detach the racist content from the work itself. And it's very absolutely hard to do. After you read Achebe's essay, you find out what's the danger in that. Danger in reading the novel uncritically, but also teaching it uncritically as just a great work of art or great work of literature. Now, that's why you see this Norton Critical Edition. I'm not a big fan of them, even though as a company I like them because they're kind of employee owned, is because they don't include the Achebe speech in this edition. So that means that one whole aspect of the critique of Heart of Darkness is not included in the secondary materials. And quite a few professors you will encounter in the academy, British lit scholars and others, those, the enlightened ones, will always juxtapose the novel with Things Fall Apart because they don't want to teach the novel without the novel that was written in opposition to it, right? And then most of them will also teach the Achebe essay and Achebe's critique of it. But some very Eurocentric scholars who kind of have a different way of looking at text might just teach the novel and may never even mention Chinua Achebe's critique of it. And that's why I encourage you to read it, because that gives you the vocabulary, not just in this novel, but in any other novel, when you want to critique it for its latent, blatant, and manifest racism, what are the aspects of a text that you want to bring about, right? And also, more importantly, why does it matter, right? For us as people living in the 21st century. And so the easiest thing to do is just, like if you want to do a non-scholastic approach to anything, you can just say, this is a racist thing, I'm not going to read it. But since we are in college, so the better approach is let's read it, figure it out, because what it can teach us then is how does it operate? Like when racism is such an integral part of a text and it is so highly stylized, right? How does then it operate in a text? And I think that's what Achebe does beautifully. I mean, he's challenging the novel for just not simply the way the Africans are represented, but what kind of cultural bias, internalized bias operates there. The simple choice of vocabulary, the adjectives and everything else that Conrad uses, and the way the Africans are not given speech. They are always offered as this frenzied mass, right? And then he goes back and tells us, well, these are the people. A few miles away from the shore of that river were the people who were crucial in launching the Cubist movement and actually the entire modernist movement in the art because of their work when it was introduced in Europe. So he kind of reverses that. Now, do keep in mind when Achebe goes and writes Things Fall Apart, it is a response novel to Heart of Darkness, but he doesn't give us an idealized African hero. That is not his point. What his point in the novel was, Africans also have the same kind of complex individual and cultural lives as their European counterparts. So he gave us Okonoko, who is, you know, a flawed hero with his excessive pride and the mistakes that he makes, things that we will expect of a European novel. So that's why instead of giving us this Christ-like African figure, he doesn't give us an idealized African hero. He gives us the complex story of the Ibo culture. Within that, how masculinity works, how tribal customs work, how one person so obsessed with his own pride and place in society can ultimately lead himself to his own destruction, but also caused by the changing order, right? That's why he calls it The Things Fall Apart. So combined together, the novel Heart of Darkness and Achebe's critique of it then gives us, you know, this really acute understanding of how literally in literature, film and movies, how there is this deep bias against Africa, right? And how it can be so easily normalized that I know a couple of Conrad scholars who have made big name in Conrad who don't even touch on race, right? Because it's easier for them to just apotheosize Conrad as this great novelist and build a career around it. But I think that would be kind of a terrible thing to do, especially where we live right now, the time and the way, you know, the racial divide has emerged so strongly in the public sphere. What supplemental material do you recommend reading before reading Heart of Darkness in order to get a deeper? That's a beautiful question, wonderful question. Well, I've already provided you some supplementary materials, right? Reading Chinua Achebe's indictment of the novel would already dispel all the Eurocentric views of art and literature you might have, because it will force you to question the very thing that a lot of Eurocentric scholars dismiss, and that is the blatant and the latent racism of the text itself. Now, another thing that Achebe is worried about and he's talking about is the question of the canon, right? Now, if this is considered one of the 15 great novels of 20th century, right, then his plan is that his idea is that this will be included in high school texts, right? It will be taught in high schools. Now, if it is taught uncritically, just as a great masterpiece of fiction, then it's not just that people will just buy into its logic, it's that whatever it's representing, the Africans, for so many people, that would become kind of an imperceptible view of Africa itself. Africa is a backdrop. Africa is where nothing is happening, right? People are not civilized. And that's the danger that he's pointing out. That's why he is calling Conrad, you know, a racist, because that, remember, this speech was made at a commencement ceremony in 1977, right? Before that, there wasn't any big challenge to Conrad on race, right? After this speech comes out, it becomes impossible for people not to teach the novel with this critique in mind. And so it unleashes a whole realm of inquiry into the novel, its place in the canon. And then if you're a teacher thinking about how to teach it, you know, I have a student who had taken this class, actually an advanced level world lit class with me, who now teaches at a local high school, right? And I visited her class when she was teaching Conrad. And absolutely, because of this secondary material, she was teaching it differently. Now, other secondary materials that you can read is, you will see, as we read more materials in the novel, you will see we have a number of theorists who are talking about Africa, and we're talking about how to think about Africa and read about Africa. And all of those will give us vocabularies of engaging with these texts differently. And so that's what I would recommend. Say Achebe says he cannot call Conrad an artist because Heart of Darkness dehumanizes, depersonalizes a portion of the human race Does he hold his view on Conrad's whole writing career? Well, that's when I wrote an article kind of slightly complicating the debate. My argument was he is completely focused on Heart of Darkness. But by indicting Conrad as an artist, when you call him a racist, the implication obviously is that if he's a racist here, he'll be racist elsewhere too. But Conrad Achebe's challenge is strictly to Heart of Darkness. But what he encourages us to do is to read his other oeuvre more carefully too. Now it's also, there is a lot of intentionality involved here. Okay, think of it this way. The 3 novels that Conrad wrote before this weren't doing so well because they were also exotic, and they were pandering in exotica because they were sailor's tale and they were set in Malaya in the Far East. So Conrad intentionally chooses Africa as a place where he's going to set his novel, because Africa has always been huge in European imagination, in romantic writing, but Africa has also been used as a foil to Europe, right? So the intention is completely there for him to go and do his research and novel, and part of it is because he wants to write a successful novel about a region of the world about which there is a wider audience. After all, how many readers can you find in England who would be interested in what's happening in Malaysia, right? In the Malay Peninsula, right? But you can find plenty of readers who will be interested in Africa, because Africa had already been marketed as Europe's other. So this idea of the foil, I mean, it's a very deeply philosophical idea, is that it's about question of individual and cultural identity. Most cultures do create an other, right? They need to, especially the dominant cultures, in order to sustain their own identity. Then you can impugn your own failures onto that other, and hence stabilize your own self. We are not dark, we are not this, we are civilized, we are that. So your self, your cultural self becomes the standard. And that is what is happening over here too. Good question. Why was Achebe so critical of Conrad for negatively portraying Africa when Achebe did that? Well, yes and no. I mean, in Achebe's novel, Africans are living, breathing characters, right? They are flawed, but we learn about their lives. We learn about their customs. There are certain customs that Achebe in the novel critiques. That novel is written from within the African culture. Compared to that, the Africans in Conrad's novel are not full-fledged characters. There are only 2 sentences assigned to them. We don't understand what their culture is, what their language is. We don't know anything about their lives, right? The only thing we get is this stereotypical view. In that sense, then, it also teaches us that there is nothing wrong with giving us a flawed hero or flawed characters, but they are characters in a story, full-fledged, master of their own destiny. There is none of that representation is there in Heart of Darkness. So in Heart of Darkness, one of the indictments that Achebe has is that Africa serves as a backdrop. In Things Fall Apart, Africa is not the backdrop. Africa, the Ibo region of, we have a specific tribe, we have their customs, we have people within the tribe who are uncomfortable with the customs, and we have an excessively pride young man who believes in a certain kind of pride. All of these things we would associate with European characters, right, in Conrad's novel. But we get that complexity of human existence in an African novel. And that is his point, that Africans shouldn't be flat characters or the backdrop. They should be living, breathing characters. That's why I always admire Achebe's Things Fall Apart, because he could have written a hagiographic novel, right? A romantic novel about wise African men and women, but no, he gives us a complex character, a troubled character, which is the point, that Africans shouldn't just be the backdrop, the silent if you want to write a story about Africans, Africans themselves should be the characters in that story. That's his point there. Um, and it's not a negative portrayal of Africa. When you read Things Fall Apart, it's not like the place was dangerous and there was a brooding in the forest. No, there are people living in the forest. They have their villages, they have their culture, they have their customs. Some of them we may not agree with, but that's the story. We get a full story of a subculture of Africa from one tribe, their customs. So it's a more complex story, which we expect about any people. It's just like if someone had written a novel or a story about a female character who is just kind of in a support role and in a flat kind of role, and then someone else comes along and writes a story of a female hero who's not a martyr, but who can be terrible at some times, who can be transgressive, but is a full-fledged human being. That is the point, I think, in the novel. I said earlier, Conrad did not originate the image of Africa, which we find in his book. Okay, I think that it was and is the dominant image of Africa in the Western imagination, and Conrad merely brought the peculiar gifts of his own mind to bear on it. For reasons which can certainly use close psychological inquiry, the West seems to suffer deep. Okay, so he's not excusing Conrad. Actually, it's even a more stronger indictment of Conrad. So what Conrad is representing in the novel obviously is not something that Conrad himself came up with, right? It's something that is what he's saying is a deep prejudice in the European cultures, right? This view of Africa. What he's indicting then Conrad of is just internalizing that view of Africa and then artfully using it to tell his story. You know, had Conrad been, according to Achebe, a more acute or honest representative of Africa, he would have already known that he's working in this discourse of Africa and maybe produced a work more complex than what he produced. So I don't see it as an excusing of Conrad, but it is saying, well, I know that Conrad didn't invent racism and these views of Africa. He's within a certain tradition. Now, as you grow in your life as scholars and students, there is another book that kind of does this, not in the African context, but in the context of the Middle East. That is Edward Said's Orientalism, right? If you ever get a chance to read that book, that would kind of encourage you to think in these terms. How are these discourses shaped? How does literature play a role in creating a larger pre-established view of a part of the world and people who live there? And then it becomes a custom because someone else wants to write about Africa, but they already have read so much about Africa. So they internalize that way of looking at it and then artistically mobilize that. If Achebe and Conrad had met in a room and spoken, what do you think their conversation? I don't know. I think Achebe would give him a lecture on racism, right? But in a way, they did get in a room because Achebe did write a book responding to Heart of Darkness, and he does give this lecture. But I don't know. I could imagine kind of a tense but civil meeting, right? I mean, we have met a lot of racists in our lives that I encounter some of them every other day, and you just be polite, and there's no point in telling them that they are racist because it's not going to change their mind. Achebe said that Conrad only says positive things about the Africans when they are put in their place. Do you agree with this assessment? Is this another instance of Eurocentric writing that again dehumanizes Africans by essentially characterizing them as pawns? Well, look at the examples that he's using. Actually, twice there are derogatory speculations about Africans, right? One is when he sees in his early encounter, he sees this African male who is wearing European dress and carrying a musket, I think, because he's been appointed a guard, and Conrad sees him as a caricature. And then when he's talking about his helmsman, watching the steam everything. So in their place, what he means is that if they are represented as totally wild or not civilized, so there is a little bit of satire there, is that the idea is that Conrad likes them to be assigned to the role of the victims only, or the wild frenzied being that he's represented, but not necessarily when they are doing the jobs that he would otherwise associate with Europeans. But it's also from that you can also build this whole idea of when people internalize that certain genders or sexualities or races um, must occupy a certain subservient position, right? And if someone has internalized that, then anytime someone breaks that mold, then they see that as a threat, because the person is not in their place. The person has exceeded that, right? And even that doesn't buy that person the kind of equality from a certain perspective, right? Not everyone. You might have encountered it in your own life when you were younger, and if you acted adult, people would remind you, or don't try to be all grown up because you're just a kid. It's the same thing. It's when you transgress that what is expected of you, that is not being in your place. So I think that's what he's talking about. But that stereotype always existed. Look at the vocabularies that were used even in America for African American men and women. Those, and still used by racists, right? Those were the vocabularies that would reduce them, right? That would place them as inferior in age, in wisdom, in intelligence, right? So that is another deep prejudice. So overall, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, the purpose in teaching this novel for me is never that it's a great work of literature. I mean, maybe it is. I don't really care. But the purpose is to kind of understand while reading it as to how literary texts, when read uncritically or taught uncritically, and by elevating them to master texts and all, how they can then end up reproducing the same stereotypes that they are using in the text, but they can then enhance certain people's view of Africa. They can recreate it into that image. And there's only one way this novel can be actually mobilized for some good, which I talked about in one of my videos, and that comes from theories of pedagogy by people who have done empathy studies. And that is when we use the suffering of Africans that is represented as a tool to ask some leading questions of our students. Not you all, but let's say if I'm teaching this class to like half of the class is a racist class, right? Anything that I say about Africa or about Africans, they're going to dismiss that because they've already made up their mind. So people who study how consciousness works, how empathy is generated, will say that use those passages to ask them simple questions. Okay, this person is suffering, this person is dying. Do you feel any empathy for it? And maybe by feigning empathy, they will then kind of develop, at least imperceptibly, this idea of thinking in empathetic terms about people that they otherwise absolutely abhor and not. I don't know how deeply that works. I've never tried it, but my friends and colleagues who specialize in that kind of pedagogy would tell you that it really works. And that's the only redeeming use that I think I can put this novel to, other than using it as an example of understanding, how racism operates in a literary text, right? And how deeply it is imbued. And that's why this piece by Chinua Achebe is really crucial, because it gives us that, in the face critique of the novel without holding anything back. So this concludes this edited version of a live lecture. I'll be back with more, and please keep an eye out for these, and I hope these are useful to you. Thank you so much, and as always, Peace and love.